Hebrews 5. So it's been a couple weeks since we talked about Hebrews, 2 or 3 weeks maybe. So to recap briefly, Hebrews 4, the chapter 3 and 4, the chapters before that, is about the Sabbath rest. He goes into this a lot, and we talked about it a fair bit. He said that there still remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God, and he explained why and how. And then he said we should make every effort to enter into that rest. And he ended that section with talking about how the Word of God is powerful and sharper than any two-edged sword, and it pierces into our beings, and that we can't hide from Him, and that all our thoughts and our being are just laid bare before Him, the one whom we have to give an account, to whom we have to give an account. And so then comes a kind of a transition passage. And I want to pick up this to the last 3 verses of chapter 4. I want to read those just to get us back into that. And then we'll go into chapter 5. Sound good? Yes, Nate. Sounds great. I'm with you. Verse 14, therefore, since we have to give an account, since all this stuff, the Sabbath of rest, all that stuff, therefore, because we have a great high priest who has gone through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold fast to our confession. For we do not have a high priest who is not able to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who has been tempted in all things in the same way, but without sin. Therefore, let us approach with confidence to the throne of grace in order that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in the time of need. He starts talking about this high priest. And with this, the preacher of Hebrews launches into like the great center section of Hebrews, which is all about the high priest. It goes from here, chapter 5, verse 1, all the way to like halfway through chapter 10, most of the book. And it comes in 2 movements. Chapters 5, 6, and 7 talk about Jesus as a superior high priest. And then 8, 9, and the first half of 10 talk about how Jesus also offered a superior sacrifice. So that's where this is all headed. And what we're going to talk about today is the beginning of chapter 5, verses 1 through 10, which is kind of an introduction to that. The preacher that wrote Hebrews is just a master at transitions, at weaving all these themes in. He introduces something then here, and then he talks about it again, and he touches down on it again, and it feels like by the end, you feel like you've been reading this for a while. Like, oh yeah, he's been talking about this for a while, even though maybe this is the first time that he's actually dove into it in depth. It feels like he's actually been talking about it for a little bit. He's just so good at it. And so he goes into this section about the high priest, and we're going to just step through it, verses 1 through 10. It's kind of in 3 sections, and we'll just see what the Lord has for us here. So let's start with the beginning, the first 4 verses. It says this: for every high priest taken from among men is appointed on behalf of people in the things relating to God, in order that he can offer both gifts and sacrifices on behalf of sins, being able to deal gently with those who are ignorant and led astray, since he himself also is surrounded by weakness. And because of it, he is obligated to offer sacrifices for sins for himself also, as well as for the people. And someone does not take for himself the honor, but is called by God, just as Aaron also was. He lays out a few things about the priesthood in the Old Testament. And he's not saying anything controversial here or new to the people that were hearing him for the first time. They were all, Messianic Jews. They knew what he was talking about. Fortunately for us, he kind of spells it out too, so I don't have to do a lot of background explaining. We'll do a little bit, but he makes a few points here. One, the high priest is chosen from among people. He's not an angel or some other representative. He's chosen from among people. And his role is to represent those people before God in things relating to God, especially offering sins and sacrifices, offering sin offerings and sacrifices, and gift offerings. And that's how he represents. It's a key way in which he represents the people before God in the Old Testament. Aaron and his descendants were the ones that God designated as the priests, right? And he also points out here that you see that in verses 2 and 3, that the priest, he's a human. He's taken from among people so he can be a good representative, but at the same time, he's not perfect either, right? So he has his own weaknesses. He has to offer sacrifices for himself, not just for others. But the plus side of that is that he can sympathize when somebody's coming to say, hey, I need to offer a sacrifice to God because I did something wrong. He's like, yeah, I know what that's like, He's not going to be someone who's like, hey, well, you need to get your act together. He can sympathize with those weaknesses because he himself is weak. We're talking about human priesthoods, the priesthood of Aaron. And then he kind of hints at it in verse 1, but you see it also there in verse 4 that it's God that appoints the high priest. This isn't something that you say, hey, I want to volunteer for that job. I'd like to be elected for that job. No, God calls that. God appoints who's going to be the high priest. And he chose Aaron. And he chose all his descendants, warts and all. If you keep reading in the Torah and on into the prophets like Samuel. But that's kind of a few of the basic things that he points out here. Let me illustrate a couple of those. Again, he's not saying anything controversial. He's just saying it plainly because he's going to build on it in what comes next. But just to illustrate a couple things, this is from Leviticus 4. The whole chapter talks about if you sin unintentionally. If you sin intentionally, that's bad. There's not really a remedy for that in Leviticus. But if it's unintentional, then you can offer a sacrifice. There were mainly two types of sacrifices in the Old Testament. One type was ways to say I'm sorry, and one other type was ways to say thank you. Right? I'm sorry is, if you read about sin offerings and guilt offerings, that's the I'm sorry category. Peace offerings and free will offerings, that's the thank you category. And here in Leviticus, they're talking about, hey, if you have an unintentional sin, here's the things you need to do. And if it's the anointed priest that sinned unintentionally, he's got to offer a bull, he's got to do this other stuff. It describes what he does with the bull. And then it goes down. If it's the whole assembly, meaning the whole nation sins unintentionally, you got to offer a bull. And so with each of these categories here, a priest, the anointed priest, which means the high priest, right? The whole nation, or a leader among the nation, like maybe a leader of a tribe or of a clan, like somebody important that has a large family, is the head of the whatever, or just a regular person, and what each of them has to do. So what do you notice here? Tell me a couple things that you notice of this list. It's not a trick question. And say again? The people in authority require more significant sacrifices. Yeah. What else? Just any citizen of Israel who's not necessarily a leader or the high priest or whatever, just some regular Moshe or Esther, regular Israelite. Yeah, both of them have to do a bull there. Yeah. First three are, yep. Yep. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. The same sacrifice has to be offered for the priest as for the entire assembly. And as Rachel pointed out, it's kind of the sacrifices required kind of are in a decreasing order of value, right? A bull, this large animal that you can plow with and takes a lot of food to get this large animal to grow, cost more, right? And so it's more than just a goat or a lamb. And the reason the male is valued more is because you got one male. You can have a lot of females, but if you don't have any males, right? The way those herds work with the harem type deal. If you're missing that one male, the stud, you don't get no more babies. If you're missing a female, but you still got other females, and you got this, it's just the way that that species works, right? And so you have to sacrifice that male, especially he has to be spotless, no blemish. Like you're not getting the runt, right? You're getting the stud, and it kind of hits home. It kind of brings home that your sin has consequences. But anyway, that's a whole other thing. But the priest and the assembly have to offer the same sacrifice. And it's interesting to ponder what the decreasing value of the sacrifice means about the people that they're tied to. And why the priest is listed first, not the whole assembly listed first. Well, because he's the representative. In fact, it says in the first part of verse 3 in that chapter that if the anointed priest sins, bringing guilt on the people. So if the priest sins, because he's the representative, he brings guilt on the people. And here I just broke it out a little bit because, we didn't want to read the whole chapter, trust me. It's not enough time. But the procedure for the priest and the assembly is the exact same. And it involves going inside the holy place to sprinkle some of the blood. The other two, they have the same procedure as well, but they don't go in there. It's less required. It's less of an issue, less of a problem you got to fix. If just one person sins versus the whole nation sins, right? That makes sense to us. But what about the priest? Well, he's the representative. He's the representative. And as the preacher of Hebrews talks about, he's also the one who has to offer sacrifices for himself before he can do some of the official duties. The Day of Atonement is the big one, right? Once a year, they do this. There's this procedure, procedure where they take two goats and they sacrifice one, and they place the sins of the people on the other one, and then they send it out to get lost in the desert. But before they can do all that, the priest has to be holy and pure before God. So he has to offer sacrifices for himself. Guess what? It's a bull again. Before he can even do that, right? Because he is not perfect. So that's what the author of Hebrews is referring to. Are you guys with me so far? All right. So I won't go into much more. Let's go on to verse 5 and 6. Remember, he ended, the last bit of verse 4 there was, someone does not take for himself the honor, but is called by God, just as Aaron also was. Thus, or therefore, Christ also didn't take on the honor for himself, right? He did not glorify himself to become high priest, but someone else did. The one who said to him, "You are my son, today I have begotten you." Just as also in another place he says, "You are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek." So, and you see there those two quotations, one's from Psalm 2, verse 7, one's from Psalm 110, verse 4. The one in Psalm 2, verse 7, he already quoted that in chapter 1. I'm sure everyone remembers that. And could have, I didn't need to say it. But he quotes that in chapter 1 as well. And there he's making the point that God, that Jesus, the Son, the exalted but also incarnate Son, is superior to the angels. That's the context that he brings it up. He used that to kind of build his case in chapter 1. So why is he bringing it up here in relation to priesthood? He's just trying to establish, remind us, right? He wants us to upload that part of the discussion in chapter 1. That he's superior to the angels, that he has authority, that he's the one that created all things, that all the stuff that he talked about in chapter 1, he wants us to kind of remember that and say, hey, this isn't just anybody, but this is that one with all this authority. And he's the one that God said that he's appointed him a priest forever of the order of Melchizedek, Psalm 110. And if you remember Psalm 110, that is the most quoted psalm in the New Testament or verse of any other, quoted or referred to in the New Testament of any of the Old Testament verses, right? Let me say that better. When in the New Testament, if you look at all the times that Jesus or somebody else alludes to some passage in the Old Testament, they do it all the time. But the one they do it the most is something out of Psalm 110. Jesus refers to it. Peter refers to it. Paul refers to it. The author of Hebrews really refers to it. It's the one that starts with, Yahweh said to my Lord, sit at my hand till I make your enemies a footstool. And it goes on from there. Psalm 2, by the way, is the one that talks about how the nations are raging against God and his anointed. But God just laughs and says, too bad. I'm going to put my king here, and you're going to have to follow him, and he's going to rule over you. And so Psalm 110, though, is where they just saw the Messiah in that. The Lord sitting at the right hand, and this thing about the priest, the author of Hebrews really dives into that. And he goes into that more later in chapter 7, I think it is. So I'm not going to go into it a lot right now. But if you don't know, or if you want a refresher, Melchizedek is this kind of mysterious figure. He only gets a few verses in the Old Testament. It's in Genesis 14. He shows up in this story with Abraham. And just as quickly as he's there, he's gone. Just like 3-4 verses, not much mention. But the author of Hebrews really dives in later to explain some of this. And Psalm 110, the psalmist looking back at that and also hearing from the Spirit writes these words, that you are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. That in that psalm, God is saying that to this anointed figure. So he says, hey, there's this priesthood, and we all know about it, where a priest gets taken from among the people and has to represent the people, and he sympathizes with them, and he doesn't take the honor on himself. But that was just Aaron. Let me tell you about a better priesthood. That's what he's doing. That's what he's launching into. And he says, there's Jesus, and he did it the same way. He didn't take it on himself. God appointed him. And then he goes on, and he says that Jesus, in the days of his flesh, offered up both prayers and supplications with loud crying and tears to the one who was able to save him from death. And he was heard as a result of his reverence. And although he was a son, he learned obedience from what he suffered. And being perfected, he became the source of eternal salvation to all those who obey him, being designated by God a high priest according to the order of Melchizedek. There's a few things here that I want to unpack. One is verse 7, being a clear reference to Jesus' struggle and prayers in the Garden of Gethsemane. A few commentators think, we're not so sure that he's referring to that. Most do. Most would agree, and I believe that's what the author of Hebrews is referring to here. That Jesus, in the days of his flesh here on earth, offered up both prayers and supplications with loud crying and tears to the one who was able to save him from death. And it just brings to mind those passages of him being in the garden. And you know, it's interesting to observe that the things that came out of him when he's in distress was like scripture and prayer. He quotes from one of the Psalms, "My soul is deeply distressed to the point of death." Isn't that interesting that when he's under stress, the things that are down, that are deep inside, is what comes out. And what was deep inside? The Word. And the prayers. He taught us to pray, "Lead me not into the test, but deliver me from the evil one. Your will be done, not my will." And what's he praying in the garden? Same thing. And it says here that he was heard. He was praying to the one who wanted to save him who was able to save him from death, and he was heard. But he did die, right? Yeah. So God saving him from death he didn't die at the cross. He was resurrected and vindicated as God's righteous anointed one. He had this claim, and they killed him over that claim. But then God brought him back to life and said, no, that was right. And that's how he saved him from death. Death wasn't final, but he did die. And that has bearing on for us too, as his followers. Maybe some of us, when the Lord returns, won't actually go through that in the same way as the rest of us. But the rest of us will. We have Jesus as the one who went before us. We know somebody who's been there. That's the scary thing about it, is that we don't know what's on the other side. But actually we do. If you're a believer, you know somebody who's been there. And just like Jesus trusted and was resurrected and vindicated, so also that is our hope. And he was heard as a result of his reverence. Not my will, but yours be done. That reverence. And so then he goes on, and he says, although he was a son, he learned obedience from what he suffered, and being perfected became a source of eternal salvation. So I want to talk a little bit about the learning of the obedience and the being perfected, because the wording in English is kind of like, wait a minute. Did he not know how to be obedient? Is that what we're talking about? Was he not perfect? Like, what is he saying here? The words in English don't help. They kind of obscure the issue a little bit, and you kind of got to think about what point he's trying to make. But let's dive into that. So I put the definitions of the verb learning there, and of being perfected, or to perfect something. Those are both verbs. And the learning is learning, right? You're deciphering some kind of information, but it has to do with not just the concept, but also putting it into practice. You haven't learned something if you just understand the concept. You also have to put it into practice, or else you didn't really demonstrate that you've learned it. This is why teachers give tests. right? This is why there's, not just in classroom settings, if you want to, my sons are becoming plumbers, you want to get your license to be the next level up, well, you got to demonstrate a few things to the state. And then being perfected, the basic sense here is to bring something to completion, right? Something that's, and perfect sounds like a weird word to choose as a translation in English, but the idea is that if something is complete, then it doesn't need anything more. Like it's done, it's finished, like it's perfect, right? That's why that word gets chosen so often to translate this Greek word. But there's a lot of places, not just this one, where kind of it's like a little bit of a mind job, like what is he talking about? Like, why? Jesus was already perfect. What does he mean? It's not about moral character or that sort of thing. It's about bringing something to fulfillment or completion, right? This of some thing that you're doing, some story, some whatever gets fulfilled, gets completed. And so when he learned obedience, it's that he figured out what he needed to do in that situation to obey God, and he put it into practice. He figured out, okay, what I need to do here is surrender my will and let his will. That's what I need to do to obey, and then he put that into practice. That's what he's talking about when he's saying he learned obedience. And that being made perfect or being perfected, he walked that out to its ultimate completion and fulfillment. He didn't stop halfway or part way, went all the way. George Guthrie, in his commentary on this, I liked how he summarized this. He says it this way: Jesus' call involved walking obediently all the way to the end of a path to which the Father had appointed him. That he learned obedience means that the Son arrived at a new stage of experience, right? He hadn't experienced what it was to follow through in obedience on this until he actually does it. So he arrives at this new stage of experience, having passed through the school of suffering. Perfection refers to the Son's having graduated from that school, accomplishing the mission, and making it to the end of that path of his passion, the passion of Christ. Does that make sense? So learning obedience until he was being perfected is just about him going on that, walking that out, going through that experience process. It's not just, oh, I learned it up here, and walking it out to its completion. You guys with me? Okay. So he says in verse 9 that he became the source of eternal salvation to all those who obey him, and then he echoes again, being designated by God a high priest according to the order of Melchizedek. So that part where he's a source of salvation to all those who obey him, that word for obey means to obey. It means to surrender your will to somebody else's. There's no mystery there. But I want you to note the connection here, okay? Jesus is saved from death by submitting his will to the will of the Father. And by doing that, he becomes a source of salvation to everyone else who would likewise submit their will to his. Right? He submits his will to God, to the Father. The Father saves him from death. And then in doing that, he becomes the source of that for everybody else. He's the first one that did it. And now he's the one that gives that to everybody else. If all those everybody else's people do the same thing he did. You can't get there some other path. You still have to surrender your will. Have I lost anybody? Okay. So here's just a summary of a few things. His perseverance made him a fit high priest. And as we saw in verses 8 and 9, I owe him praise for that. We owe him obedience for that. And his appointment to this role of high priest made him distinct from me, right, in relation to the rest of humanity. He's fully human, but he's the only one who is that high priest. He was appointed kind of, just like Aaron was the only one, so Jesus is the only one. Second thing, as a righteous sufferer, right? There's a figure in a lot of the prophets, someone who is righteous but is still suffering. Job, Isaiah, right? It's all over the Old Testament, and Jesus is the ultimate fulfillment of that, and Jesus can identify with me in my suffering for the kingdom because he did it first. He's felt the pain. He knows the gut-wrenching moment when you're faced with a test and every impulse is to run. But what you got to do is hold fast and say, not my will, but yours be done. He knows the mental anguish of that moment. When I want to do the thing that I want to do and God's saying no, whether it's the simple thing, the silly thing, or the really hard thing, doesn't matter. If it's me wanting to do my own thing and God saying no, to some level, whether it's small or large, we're going to feel that anguish of, I want to, but I'm not supposed to. Should I give up or not? And Jesus felt that all the way to the ultimate instance. And then lastly, that because of his perseverance through that suffering, he offers a fitting example for us, a great example of what it means to relinquish control of our lives and to defer to God's will. All right? You guys with me? All right, so where does this lead us? A tale of two gardens, Eden and Gethsemane. Isn't it interesting that the final test is also in a garden, with God asking him to do one thing, and then he has to decide, is he going to do that or not? And Guthrie, who I quoted from before, in his this has a great, really thought-provoking statement here that I want to just kind of land on and springboard from. He says that we should follow Jesus' example of completely relinquishing our wills to the will of the Father. That sounds great, right? What's the problem with that spiritual sounding directive? Well, we want to walk with God in the Garden of Eden, never having entered the Garden of Gethsemane. But these two gardens are a package tour with a specific itinerary, specific order. In reality, the tour lasts a lifetime as we move from one to the other. We can't skip ahead any more than Jesus could. That was really what the temptation in the wilderness was about. Here's a shortcut. Here's another shortcut. Here's another shortcut. You want to be the ruler of the world? Just do this as a shortcut. You won't have to go through that. And there isn't a shortcut. And there's a lot of promises that we have in the Bible, a lot of things that Jesus promised us, a lot of things that we've seen. We've seen those promises lived out, in our lives: provision, healing, restoration. But we can't just say, "Hey, I'm going straight to the Garden of Eden," without going through the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus said that a disciple is not greater than his master. It's enough to be the same. Don't look to be greater. And he said, if they persecuted me, they're going to persecute you. That was what that moment in the garden was about. Are you willing to die for the things that you've said are true, the things you believe? He believed the kingdom was coming through him. He believed in this upside down kind of kingdom where the last were first. And they killed him over it. He said that if we believed in him, we'd do greater works. But then he also said that we'd have strife with the world. We are meant to replay Christ's life here on earth in our lives. Minus the saving the world bit, right? We can't do that. He's already done it. We're not qualified. But every other part of his life, the general trajectory is what I mean. Every believer is meant to replay that in their lives. That's why Jesus said things like, if you want to follow me, you need to take up your Roman execution rack, cross, and follow. You know, why he said things like, if you want to find your life, you got to lose it. Because that's what he ended up doing, isn't he? Losing it to find it. And he walked in great victory and authority, and we have that. But he also suffered. Isn't this an uplifting word for a Saturday night? Yep. But that's what I feel that this is what God is highlighting, or what's jumping out for us out of these verses, is that just like Jesus got there that way, so do we. And it involves laying down our will, right? And the author of Hebrews goes on to talk about this, like in chapter 11, right? The great hall of faith that we celebrate a lot, but he ends it how? He says, oh yeah, I don't have time to talk about all the others who conquered kingdoms and shut the mouths of lions and went out to war and defeated their enemies and received back their dead by resurrection. But some of them were tortured and refused to be released because they wanted a better resurrection. And he goes on to talk about the suffering of those people too, the persecution. But it starts with answering this question: who gets to decide what is good in my life? Is it me, or is it not me? Am I the one? I have to answer that question, and each one of you and each one of us has to answer, every person on this planet has to answer that question. Am I going to be the one that decides this is what's good and this is what's not good, and I'm going to do this because it's good in my eyes? Or is God going to be the one that gets to decide that? Even when it looks like heading to a Roman execution for a bunch of people that don't care about you. I know it's a strong word, but this thing about surrender is real. And it can be so hard to surrender every part of our lives. Sometimes we have great gains in some areas, and we want to celebrate those areas and focus on those, but kind of forget about the others. And I just want to encourage you, and if there's some way that I could propel you to clean out every bit of your heart, to give it every bit of it, or the parts that maybe you've left sitting there because it's a little hard to surrender that one. I get it. I'm there with certain things. It's a journey. And next year I'll find there were a few more. And the year after that I'll find there were a few more. Just when I thought that maybe I'd given everything over. That's okay. But are you set on making progress there, right? We're not looking for perfection, like everything's you're done and dusted, you've arrived, but just progression, another step towards that surrender. So that's where I'm going to end it. With that we need to remember that when we said yes to Jesus, that we were saying to that question, you get to decide what's good, Jesus, not me. And to really take it seriously for all the grace that there is. Paul said, don't sin more just so that there'll be more grace. For all that, for the grace that there is, to really not abuse that. And to really say, I'm going to do whatever it takes to die to myself so I can live for him. All right? Amen. Everyone was rejoicing.